Değerli misafirlerimiz, İstanbul Su Kongresi ve Fuarı Su Yönetiminin Geleceği Akıllı Şebekeler oturumuyla devam ediyor. Standartizasyon, optimizasyon, hız ve verimlilik gibi kavramlar su endüstrisinde çokça duyulmaya başlandı. Bunun başlıca nedenleri arasında artan nüfus ve tükenen temiz su kaynakları yer alıyor. Var olan kaynakların daha verimli kullanımı, tekrar dönüştürülmesi ve sonrasında ise bunların çok geniş kitlelerle paylaşılması için gelişmiş endüstrilere, akıllı teknolojilere ve inovatif çözümlere ihtiyaç her geçen gün daha da artıyor. İşte bu nedenle su endüstrisi ve Endüstri 4.0 kongrenin ana başlıkları arasında yer alıyor. Bu oturumun fikirlerini aktaracak konuşmacılarımızı ve başkanı takdim etmeden evvel Keynote konuşmacımızı takdim etmek istiyorum sizlere. Çevre mühendisi olan Water 4.0 kitabının yazarı, Berkeley Water Center Yardımcı Direktörü Sayın David SEDLAK Keynote konuşmalarını yapmak üzere sahneye davet ediyoruz. Environmental engineer, author of Water 4.0, dear audience, I would like to invite dear co-director of Berkeley Water Center is David SEDLAK.
So while I'm waiting for the presentation to come up here, I just want to thank those of you who came and stayed the whole day. I know it's late on a Friday afternoon, and it's been a full day of conference and a conference yesterday. I also want to thank the organizers, ISTSU, and the organizers of the conference for teaching me something new about a water system that I didn't know enough about, so I'm really happy to learn something about the system here in Istanbul. So today I want to tell you a love story that has lasted over 3 millennia. Of course, that's a love story between cities and their water systems. We love our water systems because they liberated us from the drudgery of pulling water out of wells. We love our water systems because they saved us from the catastrophic economic damage of droughts. And we love our water systems because they protect our health. Because we love our water systems so much, we spend a lot of money building and maintaining and operating our water systems. But like any good love affair, every now and then the love affair starts to go sour. And we go sour on our water systems when they're no longer able to do the things for us that we expect them to do. Now, a few years ago, I wrote this book called Water 4.0, and it tells the story about where our water systems came from. Now, I'm not a historian. I wasn't over in the academic section for the last 2 days. I was here with the engineers and the academics who study environmental engineering. But I got interested in this topic of water history because I wanted to know how we got the systems that we have today in our urban water environment. I wanted to know how these systems undergo change. And I wanted to know what I, as a researcher, could do to try to bring about more sustainable and safe water systems. And the result was this book. And when I set out to write the book, I didn't have a title for the book, because I didn't know what it was about. But then I realized that urban water systems undergo revolutions. When they're not able to do for us what we expect them to do, someone comes up with a great idea, and that great idea changes everything and makes those systems able to deliver for us again, and we once again fall in love. So I want to tell you today the story of 3 revolutions that have already happened in urban water systems and a 4th revolution that's happening today. Now, many of my examples will come from the place I live, which is California and the American West, because that's one of the places that's at the forefront of this 4th water revolution. But I'm hoping that you in the audience will see the way in which this revolution might be relevant to some of the problems you're facing now and will face in the future. So let's get started. The first revolution in water systems, I mean, we could go back to ancient Mesopotamia, we could go over to Asia and look at China or Japan, but I think rightly, the first revolution in urban water systems was due to the Romans. This tremendous idea that you could import water from a long distance, have it flow by gravity, pipe it around a city, and when you're done with the water, put it in sewers and send it back to the river, is an extremely potent idea. It's a linear system. Water comes in one end, we use it in our city, and it goes out the other end. And that potent idea was, of course, one of the things that made it possible for lots of people to live in Rome. At the height of the Roman Empire, there were about 1 million people living in Rome, and they had a per capita water use of about 400 liters per person per day. And that's pretty amazing. And when Istanbul started growing, they adapted the Roman model. And at the time of the Industrial Revolution, when Paris and London started to grow, they also adopted the Roman model. In North America, when we finally started growing in the 20th century, we not only adopted the Roman model, but we supersized it. We created mega projects. So the two projects that I'm showing you here on this slide are the Colorado River Project and the California State and Federal Project. And these projects are really amazing works of engineering prowess, because instead of bringing water from 150 kilometers to a city, they bring water from 1,500 kilometers into a city. They make it possible for people to live in places like Phoenix and Las Vegas and Los Angeles, places that wouldn't have enough water to support a population on their own. And while they're doing that, they also generate electricity, they provide water for agriculture, and they protect us from floods. Over 30 million people in the Western United States owe their existence in a city to these mega water projects. So that Roman idea is extremely potent and has been for close to 3 millennia. That's the first revolution, Water 1.0. The second revolution in water was drinking water treatment. So as we started putting in piped and pressurized water systems in our cities, we started generating a lot of sewage. And that sewage went into the river and became the water supply of the downstream community. And people began to get sick. And so the solution to this was to build water filtration plants. And those water filtration plants removed a lot of the viruses and bacteria and other pathogens that were making people sick. And it really was a revolution. These figures here show you what happened in the early part of the 20th century in 12 American cities that adopted water filtration and chlorination. The simple combination of a slow sand filter and chlorine disinfection made typhoid fever go away within a period of about 2 decades. And once that idea got out there, no one would think about building an urban water system without first building a drinking water treatment plant. In fact, if you look at the 20th century, one of the greatest engineering inventions of the 20th century was drinking water treatment, because it extended people's lives. In North America, it's been estimated that the lifespan of the average American increased by about 7 years just due to water treatment. So it really is a revolution of sorts. So that's the second revolution, Water 2.0. Now, the third revolution in urban water was wastewater treatment. Wastewater treatment doesn't seem like much of a revolution at all. After all, it's over 100 years old. But the revolution came from the fact that people got sick of having raw sewage go into their waters, and they wanted their cities back. So cities came up with this idea that they would spend money on building wastewater treatment plants to clean up the waters in their cities when they finally got wealthy enough and when they finally became aware of how bad the situation had gotten. Now, in North America, one of the events that inspired us to spend billions of dollars building wastewater treatment plants is shown on this slide. It's a fire on the Cuyahoga River in Ohio. But it wasn't the first time this river caught on fire. It had caught on fire 9 previous times. And this time, when it caught on fire, the public was angry. The public was tired of having polluted waters. And so the US government passed a law called the Clean Water Act. And within a period of about 20 years, the United States built sewage treatment plants that made its waters fishable and swimmable again. Similar things happen in Europe, Japan, Australia, and as I've learned at the conference this week, are happening now here in Istanbul. And so these ideas that when you finally get wealthy enough and big enough, you're ready to build sewage treatment plants have been very potent. So that's the third revolution. So 3 revolutions have happened so far. And I want to talk to you about the fourth revolution. And the fourth revolution hasn't happened everywhere yet, but I'll show you today that it's happening in many places where there's water scarcity and concerns about water security in the future. Well, why are we concerned about water scarcity? Well, we've seen some talks here already where people have mentioned the topic of climate change and told us that climate change was important to water security. So let me give you a tangible example from where I live. This map shows you something called the US Drought Monitor. It shows you drought conditions in the United States as of last week. It's beginning of October. And like all these maps, when you see something that's red, that means a bad thing is happening. And what the bad thing is a long, sustained drought. And so this map shows you that the drought not only is occurring in California, but it's occurring across most of the south and western part of the United States. Now, in California, we've had droughts for 9 of the last 11 years. In those dry years that have been punctuated by 2 above-average water years, the precipitation we receive is about half of the historic average. And that's causing us to rethink our system of rainwater capture and snowmelt capture and reservoirs that supply us with our surface water supply. In other words, we might be moving towards a new normal where we have less water than we had in the 20th century. So that's one thing that's one example of how climate change might affect us. Similar things have happened in Perth, Australia, where the ocean currents have changed, and Perth gets about half the amount of water that it got during the 20th century. And if we look at the IPCC report, the climate change predictions indicate that the Mediterranean is going to get hotter and drier in the 21st century, and we'll also see decreases in precipitation. So relying upon the existing systems of surface water capture that got us through the 20th century might not be good enough. The second thing that's driving the idea of a fourth water revolution is growing populations. So in the United States, between the years 1998 and 2018, the population increased by about 70 million people. We added almost as many people as all of Turkey in that 20-year period. And between 2018 and 2038, we're going to add another 70 million people. So the good news is our population rate of increase is slowing down on a percentage basis, but that still means 70 million people every 20 years are showing up. And as shown in this figure, they're showing up and they're moving to the southern part of the country, a region that we call the Sun Belt. And that Sun Belt region is the area with the greatest water scarcity. Now, for the last 30 years or so, we've been able to keep up with the increasing population by improving our water efficiency, either by putting in plumbing with low-flow fixtures or by reducing our water loss. But there is going to come a point where conservation will be as good as we can get, and the water loss that we're achieving is about as good as it's going to get. And at that point, we're going to need to start producing more water. So what does this fourth revolution look like? This is Water 4.0. This is a schematic representation of the fourth revolution in water. And if you compare it to the first 3 revolutions in water that I showed you before, it's no longer a linear system with water coming in one end and going out at the other end. The water cycles upon itself and goes back into the system. And if you pay attention to the boxes here, and you pay attention to the arrows, you can see that the wastewater, which is now no longer being treated in a wastewater treatment plant but a resource recovery facility, that wastewater is going back into the city as recycled water. And we've heard a lot over the last 2 days about water recycling and water reuse, and I want to differentiate between a few different types of water reuse. There's non-potable water reuse, this idea of using the water from our sewage treatment plants for toilet flushing, or landscape irrigation or agriculture. We've tried that in California for the last 3 decades, and we're reaching the conclusion that this is not the best way to go. It enables behavior that you may not want to encourage. It's hard to get water from the center of the city to the places where we grow our food, and it requires the establishment of a second water distribution system. So most of the investments in water reuse that are happening in the United States now are in the area of potable water reuse. And that's the story I want to tell you about. So the first type of potable water reuse, the type that's best established, is something that I'll call advanced treatment and groundwater recharge. The idea that you put water through not only a sewage treatment plant, but an advanced treatment plant, and I'll tell you about the advanced treatment plant in a minute, and then you inject it into the groundwater aquifer, and you extract it and send it back into the city. And the grandfather of all of these projects, the one that's most important around the world, it's not Windhoek, it's not Singapore, it's not some obscure place you've never heard about, it's Orange County, California, and the Groundwater Replenishment Project. So I'm showing you a schematic here of the Groundwater Replenishment Project, and I'm showing you the permutation that was built in the year 2008. It's a huge facility. It basically is recycling all of the wastewater of Orange County. There's no more wastewater. All of the wastewater is being recycled and recharged into the aquifer. And this is building upon over 35 years of experience with something called Water Factory 21, its predecessor. So this facility takes wastewater, puts it through an advanced treatment plant, and injects it into the aquifer near the shoreline to keep the seawater intrusion from working its way into the city's well fields. But as you're injecting that wastewater into the seawater intrusion barrier, some of the water is coming back into the water supply. And that phenomena of potable water reuse through this aquifer recharge system has been studied a great deal over the past 30 years in terms of its safety and performance and reliability. Now, not every city has the luxury of a wonderful aquifer under its feet. When that's the case, we can use something that's called reservoir augmentation. So instead of taking the water after the advanced treatment plant and putting it into the aquifer by injecting it into an injection well, we pipe it around to a drinking water reservoir. So this is the approach that's used in Singapore. They basically copied the treatment plant that was at Orange County and built reservoir augmentation facilities. In California, we're starting to build reservoir augmentation projects too. And the big reservoir augmentation project that's underway is in the city of San Diego, south of Los Angeles and south of Orange County, something called Pure Water San Diego. And it's a project that's under construction now, and it will expand from, in 2021, 120 megaliters per day to something like 200 megaliters per day in 2035. And when it's fully built out, it will account for about 30% of the city's water supply. It's a simple idea. You put the water through an advanced treatment plant, and you pump it up to the existing reservoirs, and you mix it with the surface water in the reservoir, and it goes back into the existing piping system. Well, not everyone has an aquifer under their feet, and not everyone has a series of reservoirs in their community. Some people live in the flatland, and they have to do something else. And this something else is a phenomenon that we call direct potable reuse. This idea that you're not going to put the water in the aquifer, you're not going to put it in a reservoir, you're going to put it in the intake to the drinking water treatment plant. And the first direct potable water reuse project was built in a place called Big Spring, Texas in the year 2013 during Texas's drought of record when the city almost ran out of water. So in this project, water goes to an advanced treatment plant, and then it gets put into a canal where it mixes with the surface water supply before going into the drinking water treatment plant. This first project was pretty small, 8 million liters per day. But the success of this project has encouraged several other projects in Texas to be built, the largest of which is being built in El Paso, Texas now, and will probably come online next year. It'll be something like 50 million liters per day, where the water goes from the advanced treatment plant, not to the drinking water treatment plant, but directly into the distribution system, greatly reducing the energy costs of pumping the water and simplifying the process. Well, what's the technology at the heart of this movement towards potable water reuse? We've heard speakers talk about a variety of different treatment technologies that might be used for potable water reuse, but there's really only one gold standard that's been built at full scale and that's been studied in great detail, and that's the system of reverse osmosis followed by UV hydrogen peroxide. We could call this the Orange County model, if you will, because that's where this idea was pioneered. And so I want to take you a little bit into these two systems here to show you how they give us water that's safe to undergo this potable water recycling process. The first step, reverse osmosis, obviously removes the large particles, including the bacteria, the Cryptosporidium and Giardia, even many of the viruses. It also removes many of the chemicals, especially the charged chemicals. The second step in the process, the UV peroxide process, is not the typical ultraviolet light disinfection that's used in many wastewater treatment plants or water treatment plants. It's high intensity ultraviolet light, and the fluence, or dose of UV light, is about an order of magnitude higher than what we typically use for germicidal purposes. So this is a very strong combination of technologies that can achieve things like that 8-log removal of pathogens during the treatment process. Now, I'm a chemist. I think about chemicals in the environment, and one of the first questions I asked when I started thinking about potable water recycling was, could chemicals go through this system? And what we've learned over the past decade is that the high molecular weight charged compounds, the humic acids, the pharmaceuticals, all of those compounds are very well rejected by the reverse osmosis membrane. But the low molecular weight neutral compounds can slip through the membrane because they diffuse through it. And so this figure shows you here a relationship between the rejection of those compounds and their molecular weight. And you'll see that the compounds, the THMs, the trihalomethanes and haloacetonitrile, these compounds that are disinfection byproducts during drinking water, pass through the membranes. But they're not the ones that drive the possible health risk. This compound here, NDMA, nitrosodimethylamine, is a potent carcinogen, and it's only removed at about 50% in the reverse osmosis process. This compound here, 2,4,6-trichloroanisole, is a higher molecular weight compound, so it's better rejected in the membranes, but this is a compound responsible for many taste and odor problems in drinking water distribution systems. And so this compound also is present in sewage, and it's not completely removed by the RO membrane, so if you only have RO, the water will taste musty. This compound here is acetone. Now, we don't normally have acetone in sewage, but if you have industrial customers in your sewer shed, they sometimes discharge pulses of acetone, and that acetone blows through the reverse osmosis membrane because it looks to the membrane a lot like water itself. And finally, I show this example of TCEP, a phosphate-containing flame retardant, as another example of a large molecular weight compound that's pretty well rejected in the system, but I'll come to this later because it's not well removed in the UV peroxide process. So let's take a look at the UV peroxide process. Now, the beauty of the UV peroxide process, when you located it after reverse osmosis, is you've removed all of the organic matter, which would compete with the chemicals for the hydroxyl radicals. And so you have a system where you have a very high concentration of hydroxyl radical, and hydroxyl radical reacts with most organic compounds at diffusion-controlled rates. And so the way in which we design UV peroxide systems is we design them to remove this compound here, 1,4-dioxane. 1,4-dioxane is commonly present in sewage. It's a carcinogen, and we can measure it. It has a relatively slow second-order rate constant with hydroxyl radical. And so we design this system so we get a half a log removal of 1,4-dioxane in the treatment system, and we can monitor the performance of a full-scale system by measuring the 1,4-dioxane concentrations. And the good news about that is that if you're getting this 70% removal, or about 70% removal of 1,4-dioxane, you're getting something like 99% removal of just about every other organic compound you can think about, because they react much faster with hydroxyl radical than 1,4-dioxane. But there are some compounds that make it through. Acetone, which I told you about before, has a very slow rate of reaction with hydroxyl radical. So if acetone gets through the membrane, it's not really removed in the UV peroxide system. Or this compound here I showed you before, TCEP, is also not all that reactive. So if it makes it through the membrane in high enough concentrations, it'll show up in the drinking water. Well, if that was the end of the story, and I could tell you stories about how we've learned how to deal with acetone in the system, I could tell you stories about NDMA and source control of NDMA. If that was the end of the system, I'd be finishing up my talk right now. But there's another approach to potable water recycling that gets much less attention because the people who built these systems are not really very interested in advertising to the world that they're doing it because they're not sure what the public's going to think about it. These are systems where we take managed surface water and we put it through a conventional wastewater treatment plant. So we take the wastewater, we put it through a conventional wastewater treatment plant, we skip the reverse osmosis and the UV peroxide, and then we put it in a managed natural system and return it to the water supply. And the best example I can think about this is the East Fork project in Dallas, Fort Worth, Texas. This is a very large project. It's putting out something like 360 million liters per day of water. It's taking water out of the Trinity River, which below Dallas-Fort Worth is almost 100% wastewater effluent. It's passing the water through a series of surface wetlands, shown here, and after the water goes through the wetlands, there's a pipeline, and they pump the water up to the city's reservoirs. And that's kind of a low-tech, low-energy, less expensive form of potable water reuse. I've been interested in this topic of constructed wetlands and using them to improve water quality for a number of years. And what we've been doing over the past decade is redesigning the constructed wetlands so we get better removal of chemical contaminants, pathogens, and nitrate in the system. This is a system that we built in Southern California on the Santa Ana River, another system that does this kind of surface water treatment and then groundwater recharge for a water supply. And we've built what we call open water wetlands. And these open water wetlands use sunlight to break down chemicals and inactivate viruses. I'll just show you a little bit of data here because I can't resist showing you a little bit of data. What you can see is that in the summertime, we get nearly complete removal of atenolol, that's a pharmaceutical, and nitrate. That's our warm season. And in the wintertime, when the river is no longer all wastewater effluent because we get our winter storms, that is, we have a Mediterranean climate with more rain in the wintertime than in the summertime. And during that period, we get worse removal because the temperature's lower. So one of the challenges with using these managed natural systems, using these wetland systems, is seasonal variability in their performance due to changes in temperature. If we can engineer surface waters to improve water quality, we can also engineer groundwater aquifers. So what we can do is we can take a conventional wastewater treatment plant and we can inject the water into the ground. And now what we do is we use the soil as like a slow sand filter, like we used in drinking water treatment, to remove the pathogens and the chemical contaminants. And this process, which is often referred to as managed aquifer recharge, is another less expensive, low-tech method of recycling wastewater. And my favorite example of this is a project called the Prairie Waters Project outside of Denver, Colorado, in a place called Aurora. And what they're doing here is they're taking water from the South Platte River, and below the city of Denver, the South Platte River is essentially 100% wastewater effluent. They're running it through a riverbank through the process of riverbank filtration, and then after it undergoes riverbank filtration, they're putting it in an artificial aquifer. And when the water percolates into the ground, the microbes living on the soil and the sand break down the contaminants, remove the pathogens, and make the water clean. And after that, it goes to an advanced surface water treatment plant with activated carbon and ozone. And this is another potable water recycling project. Now, I showed you that schematic of Water 4.0, and I don't want to give you the idea that the only aspect of Water 4.0 is the reuse of municipal wastewater. If you were paying attention to that figure, you'll notice that we can also reuse stormwater that falls in our city. And I'll just show you briefly this idea of stormwater for aquifer recharge because it complements the idea of using wastewater for aquifer recharge. So this is a project called the Rory M. Shaw Wetland Park. It's located in Burbank in the city of Los Angeles. And what it is it's an abandoned gravel quarry where the city is taking the stormwater that falls in the neighborhood and putting it in the quarry, and from the quarry, it's putting it into a spreading basin, and the water's percolating into the aquifer. And as it percolates into the aquifer, the contaminants are removed and the water supply is recharged. Now, I want to think a little bit about taking this experience with Water 4.0 that I've had in California and extrapolating it around the world. And when I look around the world today, I see many cities and many countries and many regions that are stuck in Water 1.0. If you look at the largest water infrastructure projects that are happening today, things like the existing South to North project in China, where they want to build another mega water project to take water from the wet south and import it to the dry north, or the proposed Linking All the Rivers project in India, where they want to take water from the northern part of the country in the mountains and send it to the dry southern part of the country. I think that those projects really need to consider the experience that we've had with mega projects in other places over the last few decades. Mega projects are expensive to build, they're not as reliable as we think they should be, and there may be a less expensive way which is less damaging to the environment and the people that currently rely upon that water. So I'd like you to take away from this discussion of Water 4.0 this idea that when we look around the world, when we look at water-scarce cities like Sao Paulo or Mexico City or Bangalore, when we look at these cities and we see the terrible state of pollution of their surface waters because they've yet to build sewage treatment plants, we could think about it not as the need to build sewage treatment plants, but an opportunity to build the fourth revolution in urban water systems to create better water security, cleaner surface waters, and a healthier environment. And so with that, I just want to summarize and give you my outlook in the future. I think I've told you today that a potable water reuse revolution is underway. You can really see it happening in the Western United States, but you can also see it in Singapore. You can see it starting to happen in Australia. You can see parts of Europe starting to consider it. Water quality is the big driver. It's the thing that's kept us away from this in the past. But with our experience of the last 3 decades, we understand what happens to the chemicals, we understand what happens to the pathogens, and we know how to remove the salts. For potable water reuse, there is a gold standard, UV peroxide and reverse osmosis, that's being used today. It's a tried and true and proven technology which engineers are now willing to actually take the chance of building a direct potable reuse facility with. But there are other treatment methods that maybe aren't as expensive and energy intensive as the gold standard. Things like the wetlands and the managed aquifer recharge that I showed you. But there are also other water revolutions, and we've heard a little about them in the talks over the past 2 days. There's a seawater desalination revolution. Israel, for example, is getting all of its drinking water from seawater desalination because the cost has dropped by about 80% over the last 2 decades. What happens if the cost of seawater desalination drops by another 50% over the next decade? Would other cities be ready to build seawater desalination plants instead of urban mega projects? There's a stormwater capture and recharge revolution happening, and it may have some bearing on a city's ability to resist catastrophic flooding. So these same capture facilities that recharge the water supply might also be there to protect a city from urban flooding. And finally, there's a building scale water recycling revolution waiting to happen. And I think as advanced manufacturing grows, as the Internet of Things, as our knowledge of sensors grows, we'll be ready to put little tiny wastewater treatment plants in all of our buildings as well. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to any discussions you want to have with me.